It was my father who asked me to go. Mark needs those documents by tomorrow, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. I'd take them myself, but I'm tied up with work. You don't mind, do you? Of course, I didn't mind. Mark was a family friend, someone I'd known since I was a child. He'd always been kind to me, offering advice or a listening ear whenever I needed it. But lately, something about him had changed, or maybe it was something about me. Either way, the thought of seeing him again made my stomach flutter in a way I couldn't quite explain. The house was quiet when I arrived, the kind of stillness that made you feel like you were stepping into another world. The living room was bathed in soft, golden light filtering through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. It was my first time here, and standing in this spacious room, I felt a little out of place. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, like vanilla or honey, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound breaking the silence. Mark was a friend of my father's, someone I had known since I was a child. Over the years, he had always been a constant presence in my life, steady, reliable, and kind. He was the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease, with his easy smile and calm demeanor. But lately, something about him had changed. He seemed more confident, more assured, as if the years had only added to his quiet strength. It wasn't just his appearance, though he had certainly aged well. It was something deeper, something in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me, that made me feel like I was seeing him for the first time. I glanced at my watch. It was a little after 4. Mark had just returned from work, greeted me at the door, and excused himself to take a quick shower, asking me to wait in the living room. As I sat there, I tried to distract myself by looking around. The room was filled with shelves of books and framed photographs, some of Mark, others of landscapes, sunsets, and sporting events. Everything seemed neat and thoughtful, a reflection of the man I had always known. But now, looking at these pictures, I felt like there was something else hidden within him, something I hadn't noticed before. The sound of the water running in the bathroom grew quieter, and I knew Mark would be out soon. My heart began to race, and I couldn't understand why I felt so nervous. Something about being here, in his space, made me feel both excited and uneasy. I tried to focus on why I had come, to drop off some documents from my father, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Mark. Whenever he was around, I felt a strange mixture of respect and something else, something I couldn't quite name. The bathroom door opened, and I froze. Mark emerged, wearing only a towel wrapped around his waist. Water still glistened on his shoulders, and his hair was slightly disheveled. He looked so natural, so at ease, as if this was his normal state. Every movement he made was confident, deliberate, and I couldn't help but notice the way his muscles shifted beneath his skin. He had always been athletic, but now, standing there, he looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said with a slight smile, walking into the center of the room. "It's been a long day. How are you?" His voice was soft but energetic, and it pulled me out of my thoughts. I nodded quickly, trying to gather myself. "It's okay, Mark," I replied, though inside, I was anything but calm. He sat down on the couch next to me, and I felt the tension in the room increase tenfold. I tried not to look directly at him, but my gaze kept drifting back to his shoulders, his arms, the calm confidence he exuded. We sat side by side, and suddenly, I felt my heart begin to beat faster. It was as if, in this silence, Mark could hear every breath I took. I didn't know what was happening to me. I felt strange, a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. As if noticing my state, Mark turned to me and raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem yourself today," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "Is something wrong?" I couldn't think of anything to say. All I could focus on was how close he was sitting, how his hand rested lightly on the couch next to mine, and how every gesture he made seemed casual yet deliberate. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "No, everything's fine," I answered, though my voice trembled slightly. Mark chuckled, shrugging slightly, and leaned closer, as if testing my reaction. His gaze was soft but intense, and I felt that strange, almost hypnotic pull toward him again. I took another deep breath, trying to calm myself, but my thoughts kept returning to him. His presence, his confidence, the way he made me feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. The longer he looked at me, the harder it was to control my emotions. Everything inside me seemed to demand some kind of response, some kind of action, but I didn't know what to do. It was like a fire burning inside me, one I didn't know how to put out. Mark leaned in again, a little closer this time, and finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My heart started beating faster, my breath caught in my throat, and all rational thought disappeared, leaving only one desire. At that moment, I realized I didn't know what was happening to me. For the first time in my life, I felt something so intense, so overwhelming, that I couldn't ignore it. I reached out, my hand lightly touching his shoulder. His skin was warm, and the touch sent a shiver through me. Mark didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze softened, and he covered my hand with his own. The dim light from the bedside lamp spilled across the room, casting a warm, amber glow that softened the edges of everything. Shadows flickered on the walls, moving in time with the rhythm of my heartbeat, which seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The air between us was charged, heavy with anticipation. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us in this quiet, private sanctuary. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, steady and unwavering, and it made my skin tingle with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Every breath I took felt deeper, slower, as though time itself had slowed to match the pace of our movements. I reached for the buttons of my shirt, my fingers trembling slightly as I fumbled with them. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he helped, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. The brief contact was enough to make my breath hitch, and I looked up to meet his eyes. There was something in his expression, a quiet intensity, a mix of desire and hesitation, that mirrored my own feelings. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, unsure of how to take the next step but unable to turn back. The room seemed to grow warmer as we undressed, each piece of clothing falling away like layers of armor we no longer needed. His hands were gentle as they traced the curve of my shoulder, his touch light and tentative, as though he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't want tentative. I wanted him, all of him, with the same intensity that had been building between us for what felt like forever. When he finally kissed me, it was like the world stopped. His lips were soft but insistent, and I could feel the heat of his skin against mine as he pulled me closer. His hands moved with purpose, exploring every inch of me as if he was memorizing the feel of my body. I let myself melt into him, my own hands roaming over his back, feeling the muscles tense and relax under my touch. There was no rush, no urgency. Just the two of us, lost in the moment, discovering each other in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. As we moved together, our bodies found a rhythm that felt natural, effortless. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word only deepened the bond between us. I had never felt so exposed, so raw, but there was no fear, only a sense of safety, of being completely and utterly seen. He was my anchor, and I was his, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. When it was over, we lay tangled together, our breathing slow and steady, our hearts still racing. His arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my skin, and I could feel the warmth of his body pressed against mine. There was a quiet contentment in the air, a sense of peace that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I turned to look at him, and he met my gaze with a soft smile. His eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name but felt deeply in my chest. We didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that what we had shared had changed something fundamental. I didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was real. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. Mark's hand still held mine, and he looked at me with a soft smile. "This is a lot," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" I nodded, my heart still racing. "It does. I don't know what happens next." Mark smiled, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "We'll figure it out. Together." The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Mark moving around in the kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I stretched, my mind still replaying the events of the previous night. It felt surreal, like a dream I didn't want to wake up from. I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where Mark was busy making coffee. He looked up and smiled, his eyes soft and warm. "Morning," he said, handing me a mug. "Sleep okay?" I nodded, taking the mug and wrapping my hands around it. "Yeah. You?" Mark shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Better than I have in a while." There was a moment of silence as we both sipped our coffee, the weight of the previous night's confession still lingering in the air. Finally, Mark spoke. "So, where do we go from here?" I took a deep breath, setting my mug down. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I want to figure it out. With you." Mark's smile widened, and he reached out to take my hand. "Me too." For a few months, we continued in secret. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Stealing moments when no one was watching, sharing quiet glances across the room when my father was nearby. Mark was careful, always mindful of the line we were crossing, but there was an undeniable pull between us that neither of us could resist. We met in hidden corners of the city, spent late nights talking in his living room, and created a world that felt entirely our own. My father never suspected a thing, and for a while, it felt like we could keep it that way forever. But life has a way of interrupting even the most carefully guarded secrets. One evening, Mark told me he had been offered a job in another state. It was a big opportunity, one he couldn't turn down. I tried to be happy for him, but the news felt like a punch to the gut. We both knew what it meant. Distance would change everything. The day he left, we said our goodbyes in private, away from prying eyes. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises to wait for each other. Just a quiet understanding that what we had was special, even if it couldn't last. He hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, somehow, we'd find our way back to each other. But we didn't. Life moved on, as it always does. Mark settled into his new job, and I threw myself into my own life, trying to fill the space he had left behind. My father never found out about us, and I've never told him. Some things are better left unsaid. Even now, years later, I still think about Mark sometimes. I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he remembers the moments we shared in secret. I like to imagine he does, but I'll never know for sure. What we had was fleeting, but it was real, and for a little while, it was everything.